Well, welcome back again to Mirador Television, broadcasting from the White Hart in Lewes. It's a lovely day out there. It's only reached 14 degrees at the moment, but it's sunny, the temperature's building, and we could see temperatures getting up to 24, 25 this afternoon. And during the week, possibly nudging 27. So that's the day that is, as opposed to the day that was. We're now going to take a look back into the past, and he said with some confidence, and it is episode 5 of the bloody past of a tiny town, and it should outline some things that perhaps you didn't know about this. But also, if you're not from here, it'll give you a good idea of what this community is all about. Here you go. Bloody Lewes. Hi. Bloodletting wasn't confined to fierce battles and the tilting gentry. There were lots of naughty people around in Lewes over the centuries. And the good citizens of the town made sure they paid for their crimes. The Saxons kicked up a bit of a fuss after the Normans took over. And the new masters of the town got a bit heavy with them. The Saxons had used hanging as their way of dealing with major crime. The Normans also thought that was a decent way to get rid of naughty folk, and they kept the gallows as a punishment. Although the records of people being hanged in Lewes aren't too plentiful, the number of people going to the gallows after 1066 increased considerably. Until the mid-1600s, felons were locked up in the castle, then taken down the road a bit to this place, Gallows Bank. There is evidence that this was where the gallows stood from Saxon times to the mid-19th century. When hangings were no longer done in public, hangings didn't stop. They just weren't done in public. They were moved to Lewes Prison. But they were public until 1868, and huge crowds would turn up just to watch somebody being hanged. In fact, the modern term Gala Day comes from such occasions, previously known as Gallows Day. Chasing around Lewes can be a tiring affair, so I sometimes take a breather and come to this little corner of a park near the centre of Lewes. It's called the Knot Garden. I had no idea what a knot garden was until I spoke to a gardening expert. It's a garden of symmetrical design, as you can see. These breathers give me a chance to think about some of the stories we reported on, thought about, perhaps even enjoyed. I've just come from Lewes Prison. I've reported many times on the Russian prisoners held in the old naval prison. It's hard to forget them because there's a monument erected to them in the churchyard of one of our churches, St. John sub Castro. These prisoners seem to have overshadowed the 300 Finnish prisoners who were held in the new Lewes prison. They were from the same Crimea War in 1853. They fared better than their Russian counterparts in the old naval prison because they were repatriated quite quickly, and history seems to have forgotten them. One of the Russian prisoners went over the wall and caused a nationwide manhunt. When he was eventually found, he was in a pub just next door to the prison having a tot of rum. He'd forgotten just how nice it was to have that glass before his bedtime, so he went and found one. Norman justice was pretty fierce and pretty swift. But they did introduce an early version of the 12-man jury system. So the baddies of yesteryear were given some sort of chance. While hanging was the flavour of the day, There was also a way of avoiding being strung up if you chose trial by ordeal. I must say, I think that trial by ordeal was thought up by a mischievous bookmaker. Certainly the odds were heavily stacked against the victim. There was trial by fire, trial by water, and trial by combat. By fire, the accused had to pick up a red-hot poker or bar. If the wound healed, then the verdict was innocent of all charges. But if infection set in, then guilt was proved, and he returned to the noose. By water, the accused was bound hand and foot, thrown into the pond and told to swim. No breaststroke, just bubbles. Innocent. Sorry about that. The ducking stool was a more genteel version for ladies, but the results were much the same. Float, guilty, off to the gallows. And if you were well bred, you had the best odds of the lot. Noblemen would fight often to the death in combat with their accuser. The winner of the battle would be considered to be the one that was right. It was 1215 when trial by ordeal was replaced by trial by jury. 12 good men and true. The castle as a prison wasn't a huge success. A number of prisoners went in through the front door and then decamped via the back to the river in the hope of catching a boat out of town. When the economy of Lewes, usually robust and lucrative, became depressed in the 14th century, there was an epidemic of less serious crime. People became desperate during these hard times, and in 1396 the parson of St. John's was charged with robbery from Hamsey Church, but was later granted a king's pardon. The stocks were deemed to be a lesser punishment. On one occasion in Lewes, in the 13th century, the bishop ordered a knight to be punished by carrying the stocks through the town streets and into a church, because the knight had dared to throw a member of the clergy into his dungeon. The Lewes stocks stood next to the gallows. I don't think this was by accident. The Normans figured that the sight of ghoulish punishment would act as a deterrent. Sitting in the stocks would have given lesser villains an opportunity to view dead men dangling from the rope, bodies rotting in the gibbet, or people hobbling around, limbs severed, mutilated as a punishment. It's a bit uncomfortable sitting here in the stocks. I wouldn't want to spend a whole night here. It would make a man a bit stiff on a chill evening. But my main punishment was being kept out of the pub all night with nothing to drink but water. But the main punishment was ridicule, of course. In those days, a fate worse than death. The stocks outlasted the gallows as a public spectacle. They didn't disappear until 1872. Some historians claim that this punishment has never been removed from the law books, and indeed there are still some American states where being consigned to the stocks remains on the statutes. So tourists beware. Having cabbages thrown in your face, your feet tickled, and spending a cold night with legs locked up is hardly the holiday of a lifetime. At last, I'm out of the stocks. Time for a drink. Ordeal by beer. Bliss. Always fancied myself as a knight in shining armour. Unfortunately, I've never found a damsel in distress to rescue. So I rather think that I would have been on the side of the peasants when they revolted in 1381. Workers' unrest was the worst challenges to the Normans in the 300 years of their occupation. The main causes were an economy devastated by the Black Death, the 100 Years' War with France, and the huge tax burden levied to pay for the war. And in fact, it was this war that led to the return of bloodshed in Lewes. During the conflict, French ships regularly marauded along the Sussex coast. In 1372, one ship landed a war party and sacked the village of Rottingdean, only a few miles from Lewes. Feeding their oats, they sailed around to the River Ouse, raided Seaford, and boldly sailed up the river. Rottingdean belonged to Lewes Priory and was an important source of income. So the prior, much more belligerent than churchmen of today, took a war party of his own and rushed to defend the village. While his back was turned, the French reached the walls of the priory and attacked it. While at Cluniac Priory practiced simplicity of life, it was loaded with treasures, a fact not unnoticed by the French. I've always called them vandals.
Well, we would certainly agree here at Lewes because they destroyed this most magnificent church. We had 2,000 beautiful manuscript books in our library. We know that was documented, and they were all ruined. The buildings were systematically destroyed over a very short period of time. So yes, we would say they were vandals. And the reason that the church was totally destroyed is because this was a very significant church. Since the dissolution, the buildings have been used for all sorts of different storage. People in Lewes have used the stone, taken the stone to build buildings throughout Lewes. Southover Grange is built entirely of stone from Lewes Priory. So if you look around Lewes, you will find little bits of the priory everywhere.
One of the things about fights in Lewes is that one side or the other were jolly well unsporting. The king heavily outnumbered de Montfort at the Battle of Lewes. And now the French had superior forces to the 200 English archers who were left to defend priory and town. The English fought bravely and gave the French a bad time. And in fact, they defended the priory successfully. But Lewes was sacked and burned before the raiders had finished. And they left with 3 hostages, including the prior. These 3 fetched a tidy sum before they were allowed back home. Barely had the town got back onto its feet than it suffered another bloody nose. The peasants' revolt in London had turned nasty, and the mob had broken into the Tower of London, killing several of the king's top men. These initial successes fanned the flames of unrest, and the rebellion spread, reaching Lewes. As the unrest spread, so did the control of its leaders. Large parts of England were invaded by rampaging and often drunken mobs. Whether the peasants who attacked and broke into Lewes Castle were true dissidents or drunken louts is hard to say. But their booty from the castle were barrels of wine. "63 pubs. Oh my goodness." Anyway, the authorities raised an army, went after the rebels, and mercilessly crushed the revolt. A subsequent uprising, for much of the same reason, again caught Lewes in its net. But although the violence spread, it didn't quite reach Lewes. Jack Cade, who hailed from Kent, whipped up a mob of middle-class country folk to try and break corruption in the court of King Henry VI in 1450. Cade's rural army invaded London, but after causing havoc, were driven out by a citizens' group angry at the looting by Cade's men. The rebels were put to flight, but not until they had murdered the Archbishop of Canterbury. Cade fled London, was caught just north of Lewes at the small town of Heathfield. Astonishingly, one of his supporters was the Prior of Lewes, who escaped unscathed. Poor Jack, however, was mortally wounded at Heathfield, taken back to London, hung, drawn and quartered, and had his head stuck on a pole on London Bridge. Smuggling began in Sussex as early as 1200. The villages surrounding Lewes were hotbeds of activity. Gangs of up to 500 men plied the illicit trade well into the 19th century. The trade was given a nod and a wink by the general public, sympathetic to the idea of cheap goods. But that changed as the gangs became ever more vicious and violent, and murders of customs officials became common. There is no doubt that smuggling took place in Lewes. After all, it was a port. But generally, the Lewes public supported the law, and it's recorded that they entered into pitched battles with the smuggling gangs. Tom Paine was a customs officer in Lewes, having been sacked in a previous post for turning a blind eye to smuggling. His time in the job seems to have been without serious incident, and he was free to carry on his rebellious thoughts in the White Hart. Witchcraft is another favourite topic in the bars. Locals will look you in the eye and they'll tell you that evil spirits are brewed in Lewes, even to this day. Witchcraft in the town must be left to another day. But there is evidence that witch trials took place at Lewes Assizes. In 1565, a Marjorie Smythe of Battle was found guilty of witchcraft. She was charged with causing 2 toads to kill a cow. She was given a year in prison along with time in the pillory. 2 years later, a Newark lady, Agnes Baldwin, was found guilty of killing 2 pigs through witchcraft. There are also a couple of sillies to throw in. During this period, Henry VIII tried to stop rough footballing being played, despite the fact that every king from the 12th century onwards had failed to halt it. Oliver Cromwell banned the eating of mince pies on Christmas Day in 1654. He thought that gluttony distorted the human figure. Well, this isn't exactly a mince pie, but no, I'll leave it till later. But you know, that law is still on the statute books. Ho, ho, ho. Ding, dong, ding, dong. That's the sound of a church bell. But it's nothing like the ding-dong that went on for centuries over Lewes Assizes. The Assizes from Saxon times were situated in Lewes, and as Lewes had 2 mints and Chichester only 1, Lewes was the more important town. But the church put down its marker in Chichester, and so the town demanded that the Assizes should be located there. Lewes protested, and the court changed place several times. But they ended up back in Lewes for good. This is the present Lewes Crown Court. It has seen many famous cases over the years. Several leaders of the Irish Easter Uprising in Dublin of 1916 were held there. They included Eamon de Valera, later the Republic's first president and Prime Minister. Probably the most famous murderer in the prison was John George Haigh. He was known as the acid bath murderer. That's the way he tried to dispose of his victims. He appeared at Lewes Assizes in July 1949 and was found guilty in just 17 minutes. He was hanged by the then famous Albert Pierrepoint in August 1949. A notorious local murder in 1912 saw John Williams hanged in Lewes Prison. Williams shot a police inspector in Eastbourne, for which he paid the ultimate price. The notorious Kray twins, Ronnie and Reggie, were imprisoned in Lewes jail in the 60s. The colourful so-called celebrity gangsters managed to keep business going as usual while behind bars, hiring out protection teams to Hollywood stars. Frank Sinatra hired 17 of them from the Krays. No prison worth its salt can exist without at least one ghost, and Lewes is no different. Local gossip has it that one of the corridors is haunted by a man in Victorian-style prison garb. The most famous execution in Lewes, though, was that of Sarah French. She poisoned her husband with arsenic, cooked into an onion pie. So much for the saying, the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. I was going to lounge around in these stocks all day until I heard about that onion pie. Now I think that I'll just have to leave and go to the pub. What are a few cabbages, though, and potato peelings and rotten eggs to a veteran journalist? But that talk of poisoned pie has changed my mind. I think I will pop in for a quick drink. I'm not so keen on being famous in Lewes for being a victim of crime. Lewes, drink here I come. Well, there we are. That's a look back to Lewes. It is now 9:53. We're going to take a short break, and then we will be back with one or two other bits and bobs to take us to 10 o'clock. Sorry, to 10:30. And then we will hopefully perhaps have Suzanne Rucho to chat to. She's been doing a lot of travelling recently, but we hope that perhaps she's there in the streets of New York, letting us know what's going on with the Biden, DeSantis, and Trump affair in the States. What a choice! Three absolute villains. But you see, you get political systems, you get political parties, and suddenly the whole thing is out of your control. But trying to get as much as possible. It's just, again, are we whistling in the wind? Are we blowing in the wind? Who knows? Who knows, indeed. Right, it is exactly 9:55. I'm just going to just spend a minute or two to just pay tribute to one of our finer politicians, Stephen Catlin, who died on the weekend. Stephen, I was fortunate enough to know very well. He was a neighbour. He was to some extent a mentor. He most certainly was a friend. But also, we were able to talk on the same level. He was intelligent and he was decent. Well, if you think I'm patting myself on the back and suggesting I'm those things, well, I'm not stupid. But I need the company of people with sharp minds to bring the best out of me, and Stephen was a sharp mind.
and I'm glad that we have had him as a mentor. He was a mayor of Lewes 2 years ago, and behaved very creditably in steering this city and its community through the pandemic. And he was fearless in facing who were not necessarily his friends, because he's an independent for the longest time. And being independent in this town is you're facing all those people who belong to political parties. And I'll reiterate my distaste for political parties. I think we do very well to go back to a system that was in force at one stage, at one time in the past, is that we have people who are devoted and committed to their community, and not to a lot of the people that we have at the moment who are committed to people running around for, boasting about what they're doing, or at the same time not realizing they make themselves look idiots because what they're proposing is totally unrealizable. Oh, of course it would be good to get a whole host of things in our society going, but you have to face, to some extent, the limitation, and that is that we can only be as good as our different parts. And if we've got a rogue councillor, or if we've got a rogue reflection through our various apps, I hate using that word, but that takes a look at and investigates, supports or otherwise things that are going on in our town, in our community, and that's what Stephen did. He would motivate and initiate the now it's a committee, and of course the name has gone just at the moment that I was going to use it, having had it on my mind. Is God knows how long. Scrutiny committee is what I'm looking for. There's a scrutiny committee which looks at what the executive is about. But how do I differentiate the executive of the people that run the thing in its technical sense? Non-political, apolitical, or should be. And then we have town councillors and the district council, all of whom need to be brought to book. Oh, no, not necessarily. If they're not doing anything wrong, if they're working on our behalf, that's fine. But I rather think that many of them aren't, and we need a watchdog to show them up. This television station is a watchdog, keeps a keen eye on what's going on. But there are others, such as Stephen, who made it a principle to be able to pierce the armor that the governance or the governing body had, of the executive had, and not just to rush around without getting much done and allowing just a few people to benefit financially by tucking my hard-earned cash into something in their own back pockets. It's 10:01. I've been rambling long enough. We'll see you in 5 minutes or so. Until then, it is toodle pitch. Toodle pitch. Toodle pitch. There we go. Didn't